Welcome to the Tuppenny Punch and Judy show. That's what Winston Churchill once called commercial television. Not exactly high praise. But TV has absorbed many insulting appraisals over its 50 years, and many of them are recalled in this series on the history of television. I'm Bruce Rogers, and this hour in the series is called News Power, including a look at the medium's impact on politics. In this hour, commentators include Walter Cronkite, Chris Chataway, Fred Friendly, Sir Hugh Green, former head of BBC, and Pierre Salinger, once John Kennedy's press secretary, all analysts with appropriate credentials. A good example of TV's role in Canadian politics involves Pierre Elliott Trudeau, when he sat unflinching on the reviewing stand for a Saint-Jean-Baptiste Day parade and separatists threw things at him. His victory in the next election was assured. TV conveyed pictures of his courage to the country. But TV news does more than affect electoral politics. It can mobilize public opinion on issues in a way newspaper editorial writers have only dreamed of doing. The witch hunts of Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 50s threatened liberty at its roots by using anti-communist scare tactics and insinuation. The presumption of innocence was almost lost when Edward R. Murrow's See It Now TV journalism exposed McCarthy and the witch hunts. In the 60s, lightweight film cameras played a key role in the TV coverage of civil rights battles in the U.S., with reports of the marches and moving speeches like Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream. U.S. President John F. Kennedy made clever use of the power of TV when he played a cool hand of poker in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world watched as Kennedy spoke on TV, and the news carried photos of Soviet rocket installations. And TV's news power hasn't been ignored by terrorists. The 1985 airline hijacking, followed by television cameras back and forth across the Middle East, showed that legitimate governments don't have exclusive access to the medium. TV's need for dramatic action and visual excitement makes it vulnerable to exploitation and staged events. The journalist's view is that the news must be reported. People have a right to know, and with TV, a right to see the events unfold. In this hour of Granada TV's History of Television, history comes alive on news film and tape, the awesome influence of news power.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Director, today and rather good evening.
Simon,
Are you clear, Simon?
Yeah.
right, news story, which could well become the top, I think. Jenkins is going to resign as leader of the SDP.
A major story has just come into the ITN newsroom in London. It's 5:30 p.m. and just 15 minutes to airtime.
There'll be a new lead. Mike. Mike.
So we've got cricket. I'm going to try and put together some picture from July '82, which was when he was elected, when the election results were announced. Okay? And then I'm going to try and get out the bit from, try and get out his interview. I'm going down.
Make sure Telecine got a side of Jenkins, Roy Jenkins.
It's this ability to put a story on the air fast that makes television news the most powerful communication ever invented.
The news at 5:45 with Michael Nicholson.
Roy Jenkins resigns as SDP's leader. Mr. Jenkins' resignation comes only a year after being voted...
Television news can have another kind of power, and politicians try to use it.
We interrupt our regular program schedule to bring you a live special report from ABC News. Now, from Washington, an address by the President of the United States. Here is correspondent Peter Jennings.
Good evening. There are two subjects the President wants to talk to us about tonight. The U.S. invasion of Grenada, and it is almost 5 days now since that terrorist attack on Marine headquarters in Beirut. We go now to the Oval Office and the President.
My fellow Americans, now in these past several days, violence has erupted again in Lebanon and Grenada. In Lebanon, we have some 1,600 Marines.
The next thing we're going to do is dissolve the camera one, put the font in one, pull back, lose the font, dissolve back to VT4.
The following day, the President's message is seen to have been effectively helped by that broadcast on television news.
As for reaction to the President's speech last night explaining the U.S. policy on Grenada and Lebanon, White House correspondent Leslie Stahl reports the President feels he's been patted on the back.
The White House phone lines have been jammed. More than 6,000 callers got through, though, to express approval of Mr. Reagan's policies in Lebanon and Grenada. Only 483 objected. And a CBS News New York Times poll conducted both before and after the speech found that 65% now approve, 23% do not.
So television news has helped the President swing public opinion behind his controversial policies in Beirut and Grenada.
Grenada, we were told, was a friendly island paradise for tourism. Well, it wasn't. It was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a major...
TV news is powerful here in Moscow, too, where the Soviet Union uses it to reinforce policy. This is the countdown to Vremya, the 9 o'clock news. Vremya in Russian means time. And this bulletin will go through 11 time zones of the Soviet Union simultaneously by satellite. So Vremya can be seen in this collective farm in Muslim Uzbekistan, 1,700 miles south of Moscow. And in this Siberian village, 2,000 miles east of Moscow, where Valentina Sharipova and her family are watching the same news bulletin.
Добрый вечер. Здравствуйте, товарищи.
Vremya always begins with news of industry or agriculture, so the Soviet Union's lead story today is about productivity at a tractor factory.
95% of audience is looking at this news, and it's 228 million people. If some years ago newspapers and radio were the most important, today they're television news, because you have everything what had happened today in the world in the most condensed and informative way.
This lesson at the same Siberian collective farm school will look exactly like a television program. It's the politics class, and it's based on that week's news from Vremya. The power of television news will again become apparent. First come the headlines.
Сообщение о пленуме Центрального комитета Коммунистической партии Советского Союза.
Информация сессии Верховного Совета СССР.
О принятии закона о трудовых ресурсах.
Марш мира советской молодежи.
Об открытии Всемирной ассамблеи в Праге.
Телетайпные ленты.
Вашингтон. Палата представителей Конгресса Соединенных Штатов Америки отвергла запрос администрации Рейгана, который предусматривает выделение почти 115 миллионов долларов на производство бинарных боеприпасов.
В заключение, Андрей Андреевич.
В условиях мира это представляет собой огромное достижение международной деятельности нашей партии и страны.
The presence of TV news has changed history in every respect. It is now a factor in all history.
Story 10 goes back down as far as Sir Galahad.
Television news is indeed a powerful form of communication. 9 million people will watch this edition of ITN, which was first modeled on the nightly news in America.
in 15, 14, 13, 12, 11,
Telecine 2 row.
10 million will turn to News Center 9 in Tokyo, whose newsroom was designed for them in New York. The Russians will claim an audience of 200 million for their 9 o'clock news from Moscow. The style is also unmistakably American.
This runs 307. Dick, I'm here. You there?
They have all been modeled on a formula invented here in America, where Dan Rather will be paid 8 times the salary of the president for reading the CBS News to 22 million people.
Roll! Take track! Good evening. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting.
In many ways, American television news is ahead of ours and always has been. It's much more reporter-based, and of course they were the first people with the half-hour news.
I want to do it one more time. Re-cue everything. Let me know.
It is a personality-based news, and when you think of people like Walter Cronkite and John Chancellor and others, there is a real quality in American television reporting which is hard to equal in this country.
Newspapers and radio were where we got our news less than a generation ago. And when America first put news on television in the 1940s, it owed so much to these two, it was almost a failure.
CBS Television presents Sunday News with Edward P. Morgan.
Good afternoon. The latest news since you put down your Sunday paper spells violence from natural sources.
This is the CBS News, transmitted once a week in 1948. It is radio with pictures. But to have a successful television news, you must have visuals. They had none in those days. So this is a visual. The newsreader gets up and moves around the desk.
And the history of British imperialism, like any imperialism, is not always exemplary.
A year later, the CBS newsreader was actually showing still pictures.
And all right, in the same mood, we have some new pictures just received of Bonnie Prince Charlie, the future King of England. He's quite a growing boy now. Today he was 19 weeks old, I should have said. Looking very fine here, playing with his little bunny rabbit.
Here is the 8 o'clock news for today, Thursday the 2nd of March.
In this country, it was thought pictures actually interfered with the news. So BBC Television soberly ran that day's radio news over a still.
The number of new television licenses issued last month went up by over a fifth.
One has to remember that television was very much a poor relation of sound radio. BBC was still basking in its very important wartime reputation. Television was a small group of people doing curious things at Alexandra Palace. I remember the chairman of the day coming round to watch us, and somebody said to him, haven't you got a television set? And he said, I think the servants have got one somewhere.
The BBC chairman then was Lord Simon. His views on television news were emphatic.
The great majority of news items are of such a nature that they cannot now or ever be shown visually. It will be a long time before television films can be flown from all over the world to London on the day on which they happen. There is surely not the least possibility they will ever replace the news on sound.
The BBC did have its famous television newsreel, well-made little documentaries, but clearly not news.
One of the unexpected things about Whitcomb Fair is that until baritones all over the world began singing about Uncle Tom Cobley and all, very few people knew of it. Not far away from Whitcomb is the little Devon town of Honiton, where, as long ago as the reign of Queen Elizabeth, the art of lace-making was introduced from Brussels.
The first news to have any film pictures was sponsored by Camel Cigarettes for NBC in America.
The Camel News Caravan presents Today's News Today.
Ladies and gentlemen, a good evening to you. And now from Milwaukee come films of a tragic and startling train wreck.
One of the worst disasters of the Labor Day weekend, the head-on crash of two special excursion
The news rapidly ran out of film of accidents that holiday weekend. They had another solution.
Death toll isn't coming up to the gruesome expectation. About 450 killed so far, 51 of these dead from drowning. The total so far in traffic, 305. 13 dead in a commercial plane crash. Other plane crashes and fires and so on brought the miscellaneous total to 78.
How mild can a cigarette be?
Camel Cigarettes insisted no personality in the news could be filmed smoking a cigar. Winston Churchill, because of his prestige, was the one exception.
I'll bet you're bound to agree that camel suits you to a T, to a T. Yes, to T.
Hopscotching the world for headlines. Tehran, Iran.
When the announcer said he was hopscotching the world for headlines, the viewers got the real news of the day read from the wire services, because there was no film.
Now in progress. Washington. General MacArthur is quoted by Representative Scott of Pennsylvania and Latham of New York as saying that the United Nations forces will utterly destroy the North Korean commies before they can retreat to the 38th parallel. Glad we could get together. John Cameron Swayze saying good night for Camel cigarettes.
When the first BBC News with pictures began in 1954, it too had a strange distortion built into it.
I think there was some sort of rule that news about the royal family had to come first. And there was a joke going round saying that the favourite opening for a news bulletin would have been, for a television news bulletin, would have been yesterday, the Queen Mother did something or other.
Over the shattered and roofless walls of All Hallows by the Tower on Monday, flags and bunting fluttered to welcome Her Majesty the Queen.
Reporters and foreign correspondents weren't allowed to have scoops. Every story had to be backed up by 2 or 3 news agencies. Even I remember on one occasion when a BBC reporter was present at, on some occasion when there was motor racing on a Scottish loch, and a famous driver of a motorboat was killed, and he reported it just before the 1 o'clock news. It wasn't used because there was no agency backup.
Because television could not afford to send crews abroad, the BBC spent a great deal of time filming politicians as they passed through London Airport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Butler. I hope that you don't feel too cold coming back from the sunshine of Sydney.
Well, it makes a bit of a difference coming back to this after what we've been through. It's jolly hot in Sydney.
That these utterances had no news value and usually amounted to government propaganda was immaterial.
Now, how long do you expect the conference to last?
That's something nobody can forecast. But I do hope no one will expect early or spectacular results. They are not possible. A conference like this must take time.
The Americans, too, had their version of the airport interview. This was also propaganda.
Just back from Russia, Mrs. Pearl Mester.
I've been asked so many times about the standard of living in Russia compared with America. Naturally, the standard here is far, far superior to anything in Russia.
A breakthrough occurred which would transform this sorry state of affairs into real journalism. Television news discovered the power of personality. It would lead to news presenters like Walter Cronkite, Robin Day, and Alistair Burnett. It was all begun in America by the journalist Ed Murrow.
New York, just stand by. We'll be with you in about 90 seconds from now.
CBS Television, in cooperation with its affiliated television stations, presents the distinguished reporter and news analyst, Edward R. Murrow, in See It Now, a document for television based on the week's news.
Good evening. Tonight, See It Now devotes its entire half hour to a report on Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, told mainly in his own words and pictures.
Does this mean I'm a communist, Senator?
That's awfully funny, isn't it, Mr. Secretary? That's terribly funny.
To be accused of being a communist by McCarthy's fearsome Senate committee meant instant dismissal and blacklisting. Ed Murrow and his producer, Fred Friendly, decided to examine some of the evidence McCarthy had been using.
We began collecting material of McCarthy. Every place he went, thousands and thousands of feet, every speech, every hearing, everything. And then that March, we decided that we had enough to do a very critical examination of this man who was guilty of character assassination and who was making Americans believe that its leadership and its neighbors were communist agents under their bed. Murrow and I bought a quarter-page ad in the New York Times, the Washington Post.
They had paid for the advertisement themselves because CBS were very worried about attacking such a powerful figure as McCarthy. So television news was about to discover the power of personality. Murrow, the man of integrity, versus a demagogue.
Now, a sample of an investigation. The witness was Reed Harris. For many years, a civil servant in the State Department, directing the Information Service. Senator McCarthy summoned him and questioned him about a book he had written in 1932.
You attended Columbia University in the early 30s,
I did, Mr. Chairman.
Will you speak a little louder, sir?
I did, Mr. Chairman.
And were you expelled from Columbia?
I was suspended from classes on April 1st, 1932. I was later reinstated, and I resigned from the university.
And you resigned from the university. Did the Civil Liberties Union provide you with an attorney at that time?
I had many offers of attorneys, and one of those was from the American Civil Liberties Union, yes.
The question is, did the Civil Liberties Union supply you with an attorney?
They did supply an attorney.
The answer is yes?
The answer is yes.
You know the Civil Liberties Union has been listed as a front for and doing the work of the Communist Party.
Mr. Chairman, this was 1932.
Right. Yeah, I know that's 1932. Do you know that they since have been listed as a front for and doing the work of the Communist Party?
The Reed-Harris hearing demonstrates one of the senator's techniques. Twice, he said the American Civil Liberties Union was listed as a subversive front. The Attorney General's list does not and has never listed the ACLU as subversive, nor does the FBI or any other federal government agency. And the American Civil Liberties Union holds in its files letters of commendation from President Truman, President Eisenhower, and General MacArthur. The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay amongst our allies abroad and given considerable comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create this situation of fear. He merely exploited it, and rather successfully. Cassius was right. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Good night, and good luck.
It was a historic broadcast. Ed Murrow had won. Television seemed to magnify the good in Murrow and emphasize the bully in McCarthy. It was the beginning of the end for Joe McCarthy.
After the broadcast, a whole series of events happened. President Eisenhower took a stand. There began a series of hearings of whether Senator McCarthy had abused his power and whether there were, in fact, communists in the high echelons of the State Department and of government.
Gentlemen, will you please take your place?
With these new hearings, McCarthy suddenly found himself on trial on television. Because of the success of Ed Murrow's program, 20 million Americans watched McCarthy nightly in murderous close-up and were appalled. Television had discovered that news was about personality. The devastating climax came on the 30th day, when McCarthy wrongly accused the Army's chief counsel, Joseph Welch, of having a communist in his law firm, a 19-year-old boy, Fred Fisher, who was not even in the Senate room.
Little did I dream you could be so reckless and so cruel as to do an injury to that lad. It is, I regret to say, equally true that I fear he shall always bear a scar needlessly inflicted by you. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I know this hurts you, Mr. Welch.
I'll say it hurts.
May I say, Mr. Chairman, as a point of personal privilege, I'd like to finish this.
Senator, I think it hurts you too, sir.
I'd like to finish this. I have reason to believe that you did not know about his Communist Front record at the time you recommended it.
Mr. McCarthy, I will not discuss this further with you, and if there is a God in heaven, it will do neither you nor your cause any good. I will not discuss it further. You, Mr. Chairman, may, if you will, call the next witness.
McCarthy just sat there, humiliated in front of the nation. You could see him almost having a nervous breakdown on television, McCarthy.
Television is still held to be largely responsible for destroying Joseph McCarthy. It was probably the first example of the power of television news. 20 years later, in this very same Senate room, during the Watergate hearings, television would probe the darker side of Richard Nixon's personality.
Welcome to Channel
When ITN News began in Britain in 1955, they too were looking for an Ed Murrow figure, a man of integrity with whom the audience could identify. Scores of hopefuls were auditioned for the first jobs as newscasters. Some of the faces were to become familiar.
Q Grams. Q Chris.
Good evening. The government is not going to grant automatic reprieves to convicted murderers.
I remember the first interview that I was sent out on to do an interview at the airport with Field Marshal Harding. And of course, the BBC style of interviewing then was to greet people at the bottom of the airport steps and the airport steps and say, Your Excellency, how do you view the current situation? The aggressive, probing interview was entirely unknown. And Aidan Crawley, the editor, wanted to make some changes and innovations there as well. And I remember before I went out to interview Harding, he said to me, well, what are you going to say to him? I said, well, I shall say, well, sir. Well, don't say well, he said, and don't say sir. He was absolutely insistent that there should be some, if not cross-examination, at least some probing.
One of the striking early examples of this type of interview occurred at London Airport, when the Japanese foreign minister was tackled about a practice which was infuriating people in this country. The interviewer was the formidable Robin Day, also discovered at ITN's auditions.
Could I show you these two packages? This is a British packet of ball bearings, and this is an almost identical packet of ball bearings made in Japan, a deliberate copy. What do you have to say about that?
I think this is out of order.
Well, what does the Foreign Minister have to say about it? That was my question to the Foreign Minister.
Yes, Foreign Minister will need time to answer this kind of question. If you have this in mind, you should have given him advance knowledge.
He didn't ask for advance knowledge of any questions whatever.
Of course we don't, because we didn't expect you are so treacherous.
You think this is treachery to show you these packages?
The real breakthrough for television news was the new journalism of pictures. This is what Ed Murrow's film crew looked like on a visit to Korea in 1952. The weight of the 35mm movie cameras meant they were unsuitable for news.
Who's the man first to be released from here? Who's got his points coming up first?
Corporal Black.
Murrow was forced to bring his soldiers to the camera and group them awkwardly around it.
Are you counted by months or days now?
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Coal miner.
Yes, sir.
Where's the farmer?
The breakthrough came in 1960 in America. Robert Drew, a young journalist, built a lightweight 16mm camera which could do this. The most important thing about the camera was that it also had sound. A two-man crew could now go anywhere with startling results.
Now you run it. I can't wash my hands for you.
Suddenly, the camera itself had become a reporter. Television news could do something the newspapers couldn't. It could transmit the experience itself.
Of the United States.
The first major story to use the new film cameras was American. Using peaceful protest, Martin Luther King was trying to get votes for black Southerners. It was a story of high drama and vivid action, ingredients so magnified by the new cameras, pictures would have a marked impact on the campaign.
In the history of television in America, it was probably the first major story. It was an unfolding drama between 1955 and 1965. It was a great deal of drama in this country, in the civil rights movement, and it took the media of television to capture that drama, and it did it well. When you had people who believed in the discipline of nonviolence, prepared to sit at a lunch counter all day and not be served in an orderly, peaceful fashion, when the people around this country saw young people being beaten by hoodlums while they were seeking the right to vote, that was a sense of righteous indignation. You had 500 to 600 elderly black men and women prepared to stand in front of a courthouse in the rain all day waiting to become registered voters.
Keep people from standing inside. What you're really trying to do is intimidate these people, and by making them stand in the rain, keep them from registering to vote. And this is the kind of violation of the Constitution. You can turn your back on me, but you cannot turn your back upon the idea of justice. You can turn your back now and you can keep the club in your hand, but you cannot beat down justice.
Television had to capture them, and they showed the film. They told the story, and American people reacted.
Ugly violence was being recorded by the new cameras. The effect of these scenes brought into American homes for the very first time was one of shock.
You saw Martin Luther King and the civil rights marches and children being bitten by police dogs. It changed history.
When television is reporting events that are filmed rather than just discussing events, it has an impact that I think is far greater than radio or newspapers.
Again, like all good dramas, this one had a climax.
In March of 1965 in Selma, Alabama, as I tried to lead a group of about 600 people across the bridge from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize to the state of Alabama and to the nation that black people wanted the right to register to vote, the right to participate in the democratic process.
This is an unlawful assembly. You are to disperse. You're ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not suspend. Troopers advance toward the group. See that they turn around and disperse.
If it hadn't been for television on that day, the national news, we probably wouldn't have got the Voting Rights Act in 1965. I think what happened there did capture the imagination of people all over this country and around the world. I was beaten and left lying unconscious. I think the civil rights movement in America owe a great deal to television.
With its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Until Dr. King started his sit-ins and his marches and so forth, there was just really no possibility of getting any legislation through the Senate. The fact that a lot of people got aroused who probably wouldn't have been aroused but for the television.
We will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up.
The impact of pictures had changed history. But the networks in their turn had discovered the intoxicating power of images of violence. Soon, wars and demonstrations would become a major part of news. A third ingredient, live television, more powerful even than film, would revolutionize news gathering.
And John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 43-year-old former senator from Massachusetts, becomes the 35th President of the United States. The first person born in the 20th century to fill this great office. That is the thing we do best, is taking you to the places where news is being made at that moment. The shared experience, being able to deliver into your home that which you could not do otherwise, but being present.
Live news in America coincided with John Kennedy's deliberate use of television to run his administration.
And therefore I will now take action which will start the first generator at Flaming Gorge Dam. I never know when I press these whether it means we're going to blow up Massachusetts or light a fire or electricity, but I would go on the assumption that we are going to start the generator.
When the president pushes the buzzer, we will wait then to hear from Mr. Walton over the loudspeaker, who will report on what the generator does, and thus you'll know, Mr. President, whether you blew it up or not.
We don't hear from him. It's back to the drawing board, and we'll... There is no city in the United States in which I get a warmer welcome and less votes than Columbus, Ohio. In 1860, this speech has 3 or 4 endings, depending on what signals I get from television.
Kennedy chose live television for one of the most crucial announcements a president has ever had to make.
And he said to me, I want to speak to the nation tonight on this problem. But by that time, I'd been clued into it totally. And so I called in the representative of the 3 networks about 10:30. And I said that I needed a half-hour time that night. And they said, why? And I said, a subject of high national importance.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
It was made clear that we faced a major crisis. The people lived through 2 or 3 days there of really genuine fear, alarm over the possibility of the outbreak of a major war, and a nuclear one at that.
The Cuba crisis was the turning point for television as a news form.
And the crisis between the 2 great powers was moving at such an enormously fast rate that, in a sense, the morning papers were out of date by the time they were printed. And it was television news which gave the people the up-to-the-minute information. People in this country got accustomed to looking to television for the latest information and interpretation of the big event when it came.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
At the United Nations, too, there was live drama on an awesome scale.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
The presidency of John F. Kennedy ended with the biggest live news story ever.
Gave it a great deal of thought, Grandpa. And afterwards...
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting.
But we got on with audio bulletins on the television network within a very few minutes. Just whatever it took me to run around the corner into the audio booth. And then, of course, the events began tumbling upon us. The motorcade had veered off and was on the way to Parkland Hospital, and we got on the air very shortly thereafter.
Policemen with drawn gun. The shots have just been fired. A state of mass confusion grips the entire area, people hitting the ground.
The cameras then switched live to the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president had been due at a lunch.
As you can imagine, there are many stories that are coming in now as to the actual condition of the president. One is that he is dead. This cannot be confirmed. Another is that Governor Connolly is in the operating room. This we have not confirmed.
When Lee Harvey Oswald pulled the trigger, there began a new kind of communication between television and 200 million Americans. Because it was live, viewers were getting the full horror as it happened. Events moved so fast that at no time did the reporters know more than their audience.
And who are you, sir? I'm the one here. We have just been told by a member of the staff at Parkland Hospital the president is dead. This is not. What is the governor's condition? He's been shot in the chest. In the chest. Do you have any report on that? Oh, no. Thank you, sir.
Our ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, was assaulted in Dallas, leaving a dinner meeting there. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital.
Parkland Hospital in Dallas. These shots occurred just after the president was pronounced dead and the announcement was made to the public. Utter disbelief, shock, sorrow, all the emotions.
Then the return to Washington that night, as they all got off the plane, the body was very dramatic, of course.
Mrs. Kennedy had made the trip from Dallas aboard the plane, accompanying the body of her husband. She had carried herself with dignity and restraint. Now she had returned to Washington. In the morning, she would have to tell her 2 children that their father had been murdered. Mrs. Kennedy had not changed clothes. Her dress and her stockings were stained by the blood shed by the dying president.
Now, very quickly, back to Dallas Police Headquarters for a videotaped live camera scene of Lee Oswald as he was brought into another room for questioning.
People have given me a hearing without legal representation or anything.
Did you shoot the president?
I didn't shoot anybody, no, sir.
You just heard Oswald, who said he did not shoot anybody. None of these
Step back.
Now the casket. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, leaving the White House for the last time.
Sunday, 2 days later, saw the lying in state. Exhausted commentators had been covering non-stop since Friday, improvising as the drama unfolded. On that Sunday, there was yet more to come.
Mrs. Kennedy, Caroline, and John. And now the caisson and the casket are moving down the drive.
At that same moment, another procession was forming in Dallas.
This is the basement floor of the Dallas City Hall, and that's a scuffle on the basement floor. It seems to concern photographers.
He has been shot. Oswald has been shot. Here comes the ambulance. And Oswald will be removed now.
Within an hour of the new shooting, 4 out of 5 television sets in America were switched on.
Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, his and his daughter, are walking up to the casket. This will be her last goodbye for today.
I think then we flash next to, in my memory, to the actual funeral.
Monday, the 4th day, was the funeral. On that day, television produced images of dignity and human frailty that would move the world.
The cortege and the crying people along the way, I think the riderless horse, of course, is always impressive. Then the people, I think, the faces of people in the crowd and the realization what mass agony was really about. And then that terrific shot that we had on a long lens of the dignitaries with de Gaulle's magnificent height leading the way and the rest sort of around him.
television held the nation together. Nations which have a 40-year-old president shot from under them, almost live, are in danger of disintegrating. I think it's broadcasting's finest hour, and I think it may have saved this country.
It certainly did a lot for television news. 400 million viewers throughout the world had watched the funeral. Overnight, news in America was a profit and ratings winner. With this one event, pictorial news achieved domination. It was the same in London and Tokyo. But if television news has become the most powerful form of communication ever, what are its limitations?
And can I move story 15 to 11?
What does it do on an average day when there are no great events like the McCarthy hearings or the civil rights battles? June the 20th, 1983 was a very average day for news around the world.
6, 5.
On that day, ITN have a political news flash. Not much there.
EJ2 roll. On air.
Roy Jenkins resigns.
NHK in Tokyo have a complicated story about defense.
こんばんは。今夜はこれから大いに論議を
Vremya in Moscow, a story about tractor production. Certainly nothing there.
Социалистические обязательства, принятые в честь...
Good evening, this is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting.
And in New York on that day, yet a different lead story.
Congressional investigators today said, in effect, that the federal war on drug smugglers is having the impact of a pop gun. And they
None of these four stories have the vital ingredient for good television. So what did the programmers do? Key decisions are made at the daily conferences. Here's ITN's. There's no sign of Jenkins' resignation yet. The rest of the news looks dull, so they're looking for good, reliable picture stories instead.
Film package from David Smith has been cut to 3:35. It's on famine conditions in Tigray. Some pretty harrowing pictures of starving children, etc.
The Beast of Exmoor. This is this great big dog that's been going around savaging the sheep on Exmoor. The news point today is that two police forces are meeting to combine their efforts.
In Sicily, EVN Zero are offering some pictures of a policeman who got so upset at the taunts of the crowd he shot them, killed one and injured about 30, I think. Depends on what the pictures show, really.
These pictures from Italy are already coming into the Moscow newsroom over the international link. It's not an important story outside Italy, but 3 out of the 4 bulletins will use it that night. It's ideal for television. Drama, action, violence. At the NHK conference in Tokyo, they have a scoop. It's a difficult story about Japan's defense arrangements.
対抗の見直しを防衛省が、見直しの検討に入ったことが明らかになったというニュースでありまして、防衛大綱というのはご承知の通りに今の防衛政策の基本になっているやつなので、これの見直しということになると。
Something much easier to deal with comes in. A fire in Tokyo. Television is on safer ground here. A fire means drama, and so good pictures. Already, crews from opposition stations are overhead and filming. Unfortunately, when NHK arrive, the flames are out. A fire without flames is not a story. The cameraman goes back to the defense story. This scoop will be the lead that night, but it will show the limitations television has in dealing with a complicated political story.
Scoop about the defense statement, and Mr. Domoto of the political department is going to make a report somewhere around the defense agency.
It's based on a leak from inside the Ministry of Defense, which no one will confirm by interview. There are no other pictures. The correspondent resorts to the time-honored formula of a piece to camera outside the ministry.
Okay.
This is likely to touch up a new controversy over the issue of further strengthening of the defense capabilities. The government...
NHK try out the story on the early news, which is also in English. The editor decides it's dull visually. In desperation, they add dramatic film of army weapons.
...with a limited and minor invasion by itself.
The editor is still not satisfied. For the main evening news, they try another approach. They personalize the story.
Well, we thought of doing it on stand-up report, but
The story is rather complicated. I thought it was more persuasive if the reporter comes to the studio. And also, it's a controversial story, and probably the audience have many questions they would like to ask. So I thought that maybe I should ask in the part of the audience.
Even bringing the reporter who got the scoop into the studio does little to bring the story to life. Television news here is acting only as a headline service. The story will be better explained in the morning's newspapers. The editorial conference in Moscow. It's 3 hours to the first transmission, but there is little excitement now. The lead story about tractor productivity has been prepared a month ago. State-run Soviet television has to be constructive. The results, predictably, are dull. Back at ITN, the news is about politics. Television's problems will become very apparent.
Thatcher is announcing the junior government appointments today. It'd be interesting to see what she does with Ian Gow and who the other rising stars are likely to be and who the people she feels she can do without.
This is what they later get on film. A procession of ministers entering meetings. They wave, but they keep their secrets.
And we're still trying for Francis Pym, which we have been doing ever since he was sacked.
Again, this is what they get.
There we are, that's right.
On an average day, half of television news consists of politicians going in and out of buildings. Until television has access to Parliament or to select committees, newspapers will always report politics better. Down in the newsroom, it's been a bad day.
I've got one story. We're on the air in 50 minutes. That's news.
With 15 minutes to go, they get the Roy Jenkins resignation.
I've just had a garbled message, but I understand that he said he hopes Owen returns.
Probably the shots that were going for also would do, as soon as possible.
Good evening. Mr. Roy Jenkins is resigning as leader of the SDP.
ITN are first with the story.
There was a widespread feeling that he'd been outshone by Dr.
But television's coverage is a statement read from the House of Commons by the political correspondent.
With calls from party members demanding a change of leadership.
Contrast that bleak day of news with this one.
This is, Andrews is 8 from Beirut, right?
Television news requires big events with drama, excitement, action. This is the CBS newsroom in Washington, the week of the Beirut bomb and the American invasion of Grenada.
Sir, when they land with the wounded are going to go from there to the hospital. Then they're going to take crews over to the hospital to do the interview.
Duffy says there are already 8 crews at the hospital, according to Hyde.
Yeah, you've got 8 bodies dead. You've got 1 Marine U.S. confirmed, 7 unknown soldiers.
On a day like this, the news is live. Pictures are coming in from Grenada as they happen.
Heavy fighting occurred on the evening of 27 October at the Calvigny military barracks area. Airstrikes and artillery were used to help our forces secure that area.
In the next editing room, the director is watching live pictures at an Air Force base as the battle wounded are flown home.
The 141 that's coming inbound right now, getting ready to land, is your 141 airback.
Wars are fought in the homes of the American people, and there's a big question about what does all that mean. Grief is shared in the homes of American people when you've seen such things as the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut.
Stand by to squeeze.
Continuing to receive small arms fire.
How long? Squeeze.
6,000 U.S. soldiers now ashore. Most of the remaining fighting is taking place in the south.
Television news made its reputation bringing audiences to the great events of history.
Navy jets from the...
In the last 2 decades, this has often meant putting wars, demonstrations, and terrorism onto the screen, causing worries for audiences and governments.
Oh, track. Defense Department, faded book almost loses.
Next week, we examine these concerns in Television News, The Power of Pictures.